A Japanese celebrity living in Seoul welcomed a son into the world last month, announcing his birth in a televised interview, saying that she'd chosen to become a single parent. She says she went through IVF treatment in Japan as it wasn't possible for unmarried women in South Korea to do so. Now, this set off a discussion across Korean society, not just simply regarding the legality of fertility treatment in the country, but it triggered a broader contemplation on the challenges single women in Korea face when they are raising children without a ring on their finger. It also raised the issue of marriage, as in recent years, it's shown that fewer Koreans are willing to walk down the aisle. We talk about how families are becoming much more diverse in South Korea and how to best support them in all their shapes and sizes. For this, we're joined by Dr. David Tizard, Professor of Politics at Seoul Women's University. It's great to see you this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
We also have Dr. Ali Seo, Professor of Psychology at Seoul Women's University. Again, it's wonderful to have you back on the show.
Good morning.
Good morning. Now, well, let's start with you, David. Now, beginning with Sa유리, the Japanese celebrity who raised the rather contentious issue of South Korea banning single women from receiving fertility treatment. Of course, it isn't an outright ban. But the law does require a woman to receive her spouse's consent before undergoing the procedure, which is also only available to married couples. And of course, surrogacy is also banned. So what are some reasons that these regulations were put in place in the first place in South Korea? And are they too strict compared to other countries?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say congratulations to Sayuri and the birth of her son. It's a wonderful thing to bring a person into the world like that, however it comes about. And we know that there's not always one standard. Every family is different. Every set of circumstances can be exceptional or unique to that person. And that's the way that Sayuri decided to go about it. According to her own circumstances, there were health issues involved and advice from doctors as well as larger cultural issues. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that this should be a topic for Sayuri in particular of celebration, of congratulations. Yes, it's raised a wider conversation about what is permissible and what shouldn't be permissible in South Korea. It's also interesting that it's come from a Japanese celebrity. Surrogacy has largely been forbidden in South Korea. There was a 2018 court ruling that said the act of giving birth is the factors in determining the parenthood of a child. Now, South Korea has long had a focus on genealogical continuity. The mother and father has been of prime importance in South Korean law and perhaps more South Korean culture. We know that many children are not adopted in South Korea. Traditionally, they went to the United States or Germany. So in the modern age, South Korea is slowly coming to the terms with not every family is the same and every family is different. And what are the appropriate laws and what are the appropriate government support that people should be doing to support this? Because life is not always like a perfect drama or a Disney movie where we have these situations. So that's the challenge, I think, that South Korea is now facing.
Mm-hmm. And it's triggered quite a broad discussion. And well, Ali, now Miss Fujita, she wanted to be a mother, but not necessarily a wife. And whether you agree with this or not, well, it's all down to our personal values, I suppose. But we all do have to admit that it is a very tough decision to make, a huge financial, psychological, emotional commitment. And in most cases, women don't really have the luxury of making the choice that Miss Fujita did. And so in many societies, not just in Korea, a lot of people do disapprove of single parenting because of the various concerns involved. And some even say that it breaks the conventions of what a family should look like and could potentially compromise a child's upbringing. What would you have to say about this?
Well, that's a really good question. And, there is some research that does show that single-parent households do increase the risk of problems for children. However, a lot of these studies have mainly focused on divorced families. And so it's really difficult to know whether it's just the divorce itself that's the main cause of the problem in children. And I do think it's important to note that being in a double-parent household may be actually more detrimental to the child's mental health if there's abuse abuse and constant conflict involved. So if that's the case, maybe the child will probably be better off living with a warm and supportive single parent. And, additionally, while there are probably increased challenges for single parents, it doesn't necessarily mean that growing up in a single parent household guarantees that the child will be worse off. It's not the one determining factor. And there's plenty of studies that do show that there's a wide range of risk factors for mental health issues in children. And that's aside from being from a single parent household.
And Ali, now in the media, in Korean media, we've seen women who raise children on their own being labelled as piommo, which actually translate to unmarried mother. And while being from a single parent family myself, my mother having raised me herself, it's a little bit upsetting. I mean, we rarely hear the term piombu, which would mean unmarried father. Do you think terms like this really add to the social stigma around single mothers in particular? And should that be changed, do you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. There's definitely some stigma around single parented. And until recently, it was actually impossible for a single unmarried father to register the birth of his child under his name. I mean, it kind of works both ways. And this was only possible for the mother, which resulted in children living without any documentation or identification numbers if their father were to raise them alone. And not only is this unfair to fathers, but it also burdens the mother of taking care of the child. It really enforces that stereotype. So I think the government should really focus on the fact that single parent families should be able to have the same rights and benefits as any traditional family. The policies that they put forth should be neutral, not focus on any type of moral judgment on why they become a single parent household in the first place.
And David, as you briefly mentioned, South Korea has long been a homogeneous society, and it's been rather obsessed with bloodline, and there's obviously been the Confucianist values on family, and particularly about women's role in the family. But is it really productive or healthy to insist on maintaining these kind of values in a society where fertility and marriage rates are continuing to decline? Do you think we're sort of seeing a backlash against these values?
I'm not sure whether it's appropriate to compare this issue with the falling birth rates, but I think they're separate. I don't think we should necessarily be arguing that because the nation is having demographic problems, it's an aging society, therefore we need to focus on allowing better childbirth, because it seems to be putting pressure. It seems to be applying that is the purpose of people. And people should be ends in and of themselves rather than to reproduce. I agree with what Dr. So is saying, that there should be laws, they should be neutral, they should be free of moral judgment and supportive of anybody. But in terms of the culture, you're correct to say that there has been this Confucian attitude in society. Is there a backlash against it? Yes. Has it been wholly bad? I'm not sure. We have to remember the specific historical context of South Korea. It was a post-colonial society suffering from imperialism. It had to embark on a course of nation building with a legitimacy threat from North Korea, with military problems as well. And so it constructed a narrative of one family. It constructed a narrative, this kinship that spread throughout the country. And that part of that was probably very useful in the economic success that it saw. However, now we're seeing that elements of it aren't that productive. It needs to move away. The challenge is, how does this conversation take place in society? Laws are very good, they're top down, and they help, but it's what happens in people's minds. It's the ideas, it's the language. So Dr. So was talking about that the language should be neutral. I agree. We also need to try to imprint these ideas in people's consciousnesses. I think that's where the real change will come. That comes through conversation, that might come through media, it might come through art and stories. We might see more representation. So there is a movement that's completely natural, but I think it's how that movement takes place is very important.
And Ali, how have perceptions on marriage really been changing among South Korean women amid all this?
Well, as Dr. Tizard just mentioned, the landscape of traditional families have definitely been changing. And I think this is not only in Korea, I think it's definitely a global movement. There are more traditional, non-traditional families, and many families are multicultural, same-sex families, blended families, single-parent families. And additionally, I think many younger people are getting married at a later age, having children at a later age. And more younger people are also fine not having children or even not getting married at all. And I think, with this changing landscape, there's more room for diversity. And I think people will probably start finding it a lot easier to accommodate and accept different types of families as well.
So I personally felt that perceptions are changing to embrace more and more of this diversity. But of course, as you both mentioned, it's so important to make this more systematic in the legal language and just how the government really supports the diversity of families. And again, having come from a single parent family, I know that it's so difficult to get support from the government because of these long held traditional values that made it into the legal system. And David, the government did announce measures to strengthen support for single mothers and single parents from the early stages of pregnancy by expanding counselling services and mentoring programs. And it also expanded child support to include single parents who are under the age of, formerly it was the age ceiling was 24 years of age, but now it's 34 years of age. So it is trying to make these changes. But do you think it's enough, though? What more needs to be done to ensure that all families in all their shapes and forms, they're really embraced by the social system?
Yeah, some of those changes you mentioned, So Young, are very important, offering more counselling availability, and the Gender Ministry is doing this through services and social media to reach out. I think what needs to happen from a political point of view is that politicians embark on these changes without the fear of losing political support. We know that in 2012, the presidential candidate at the time, Moon Jae-in, he was advocating that he would support certain rights, whether it's LGBT or such forth. But then when he assumed power, he realized that in terms of political expediency, supporting these types of families, as Dr. So mentions, whether it's single parent, whether it's same sex, whether it's blending, that might not gain a lot of political support. It might actually lose political support. Now, what we have to do, this conversation has to take place regardless of whether we are affected by it personally. So, for example, you've mentioned how you were raised in a single parent family. It's great to share that. But I think it's important that all people respect that this is an important case, whether or not it affects us personally, because it affects members of society and it affects people around us. So we shouldn't be thinking so much of personal interest or political support from the politicians. We need to be thinking about the decency and the human rights of individuals. So that's what I would like to see take place, that people stand up and try to do it regardless of personal interest and regardless of political support or expediency. That's perhaps what could or should happen.
Right, so we should really look at it from a broader human rights perspective. And Ali, now single parenting, again, it's hard enough as it is, even for those who are co-parenting, but then to receive all the stigmatization, that makes it even tougher. And well, what challenges do South Koreans single mothers face, and how should parents, especially women, be supported mentally, systematically and psychologically when they're going about it alone?
That's a good question. So most of the issues that come up with challenges with single mothers comes from lack of social support and economic issues. And single mothers may face not only the non-shared care of a child, but also economic problems resulting from discriminatory wage levels and the absence of a second income from a partner. So I think it's important to understand that problems that arise in children aren't just because the child is being raised by a single parent. And most of the problems stem from the single parent being overburdened due to lack of support, finding time to balance work, child rearing, self-care. And so I think it's important to recognize that help can come from various levels, from a governmental level, providing more support for childcare, vocational training, more access to mental health services that doesn't burden the parent economically. And on an individual level, if you know someone who's a single parent, reach out, provide some emotional support so that they know you're there for them, offer to take care of their child for a few hours so that they can get some time to recharge. And I know these things may seem quite small, but they can definitely go a long way.
I think you're definitely right. Those small acts can go a very long way. And well, before we conclude this discussion, I'd like to ask both of you, well, let's start with you, David. How should then the conversation on family values be steered in South Korea in order for us to move forward as a society?
Well, perhaps, Soo-young, you're doing exactly the right thing by having this conversation take place on the news, which is a really good thing. Having experts such as Dr. So provide the research and literature, which gives a good grounding in what's actually happening. I also think in terms of media representation, if we allow these stories to be more presented, I think art is a great way of steering conversation. We saw with the book Kim Ji-young, 1982, how that was able to do it. People are moved by metaphor, by narrative, by these types of things. So law is important. I think I would like to see more representation in the wider media, in art, and I think this might have a positive effect.
And same question to you, Dr. Ali. Now, how do you think the conversation on family should take place in South Korean society?
I absolutely agree with Dr. Tizard in terms of more representation, even, opening the dialogue and things like that. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, maybe it's important to have different expectations of what a family looks like due to the changing landscape of how families are changing. And I think the important thing is that regardless of what your family looks like, traditional or non-traditional, you have people who love you and care for you. And I think especially in this COVID-19 era, we can all appreciate how important it is to be supported and have family members that you care about.
Well, with that, I'm afraid that's where we must leave today's discussion. But thank you both very much. That was Dr. David Tizard, Professor of Politics at Seoul Women's University, and Dr. Ali Seo, Professor of Psychology at Seongjin Women's University. Again, thank you both so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, thank you as always for watching. We hope you have a wonderful weekend wherever you are. Goodbye.